Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe Little, here with Sam Chaser. Today, we're asking the uncomfortable one. When your sleep app hands you a score, does that number start deciding what you think you felt?
Yeah, because once rest turns into a grade, it gets weird fast. Fitbit says sleep score is a 1 to 100 score based on sleep duration, sleep quality, and restoration, not a direct measurement of how rested you feel.
Right, so the number is supposed to help, but it can still boss you around. Let's start with the basic suspicion here. Sam, take it away.
My starting suspicion is simple. Sleep scores take something fuzzy and private and turn it into a grade. And once there's a grade, people stop asking how they feel and start asking whether the little number will approve them. Before we get lost in the wellness wallpaper, that's the question I want on the table first.
That's the tension, yeah. A score can be useful as a summary, but it can also sneak in a weird kind of authority, like the app has become the final judge instead of just a tool. And those are not the same thing, even if the UI makes them look equally calm and scientific.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the problem isn't just the number itself, but the authority people hand to it? Because if it's only a clue, fine. If it starts telling you whether you're allowed to trust your own body, that feels like the actual break.
That's the cleaner version of it. The useful version is, here's some data that might help you notice patterns. The problem version is, this data knows you better than you do. And consumer sleep trackers are usually estimating sleep from wearable sensors and algorithms, not directly measuring brain activity the way a sleep lab would. So, the confidence people feel can be out of proportion to what the thing is actually doing.
Right. And the apps don't exactly hide that they're building a composite. Fitbit, for example, describes sleep score as a 1 to 100 score based on things like sleep duration, sleep quality, and restoration. Aura builds its score from pieces like duration, efficiency, restfulness, timing, latency, and sleep stages. That's not nothing, but it's also not a direct reading of how rested your nervous system feels when you wake up.
And that's the part people glide past. A score made from several inputs sounds objective because it's a number, but it's still a summary of imperfect signals. The app can be honest about its ingredients and still end up feeling more certain than the body does, because numbers have this annoying habit of sounding final.
Exactly. The minute it becomes a number, it starts acting like a verdict. You can wake up saying, I feel okay, and then look at the score and suddenly you're negotiating with the machine about your own experience. That's a bizarre little shift, and it happens fast.
It's not that the machine is always wrong. It's that the machine is now in the room when you're trying to decide what you feel. And that changes the conversation. People don't just use the number. They start using it as permission to believe or disbelieve themselves, which is a much bigger thing than tracking.
And that's where the report card feeling comes in. You go to bed wanting rest, not a performance review from mattress-adjacent software. I know that sounds a little dramatic, but the emotional move is real. A private bodily experience gets converted into a score that now feels entitled to speak over you.
The fair version of the complaint is not scores are evil. It's that a tool built to help you notice patterns can slide into a quiet authority problem. If the score is just telling you, last night looked lighter than usual, that's one thing. If it's making you second guess a perfectly ordinary morning because the number was low, that's the part worth pressure testing.
So the real issue is who gets the final say? Is it the body, the feeling, the pattern, or the app's little verdict at the top of the screen? Because once those don't line up, people have to decide whether they're listening to themselves or outsourcing the decision to the score.
Yeah, and that's the right place to leave it for now. Not is sleep tracking always bad, But when does a helpful summary become the thing that overrules your own sense of rest? That's the question the rest of the episode has to earn.
Okay, but the reason this bugs people isn't just accuracy. It's that the score starts feeling like the official opinion on how your body is allowed to feel.
That's the sticky part. A reminder is one thing. A ranking is a little more bossy, even when it means well.
And sleep is already private and subjective. Nobody else gets to feel your exhaustion. So the app showing up like it has the answer can feel weirdly presumptuous.
So the complaint isn't, I hate data. It's that the data can start talking over the person. Am I overstating that? Or does the product framing really nudge people toward trusting the number before they trust how they actually feel?
I think it does. A bad night goes from, I slept badly, to the app says I slept badly. And then your own body starts feeling like testimony you need to defend. That's what makes it annoying. Not because people are incapable of thinking for themselves, but because the number arrives with this fake, calm confidence and makes your tiredness sound optional.
Like your body needs permission.
Yeah, exactly. And once that happens, a normal bad morning can start to feel like a personal failure instead of just a rough night. You wake up foggy, see a low score, and the feeling is no longer just, I'm tired. It becomes, I did sleep wrong, or I'm not taking this seriously enough.
That's the part people skip. The app isn't only giving information, it can also hand out a kind of emotional permission slip. And because these products are usually framed as actionable feedback, the number doesn't just sit there politely. It invites you to react to it, to fix something, to treat it like it deserves the first word.
Right, and most people don't walk around doing formal audits of their own sleep. They check the score because it's there. And then they look at their body second, which is backward but very human. If the number says one thing and your head says another, the number has this annoying advantage because it looks cleaner than a groggy opinion.
And there is a real reason that mismatch gets under people's skin. Consumer sleep trackers have shown mixed performance, especially around wake and some sleep stages. So the app can be confidently wrong in places that matter to the person using it. That doesn't mean the whole thing is junk, but it does mean the authority can outrun the evidence.
So now the weird part is not just that the score exists, it's that it can train you to distrust your own sense of rest unless the app agrees with it. That's a little bonkers when you say it out loud, because sleep is one of the few things where the body gets a vote, and the app somehow starts acting like the chair of the board.
Mostly, yeah. Not every user will do that, and some people will treat the number as a rough cue and move on. But for the people who are already a little anxious or a little eager for a clean answer, the score can become a standard for whether the feeling is legitimate. That's where it gets sticky. Not because it's evil, but because it starts borrowing more trust than it has earned.
So the fair version of the complaint is not apps should never measure anything. It's, why does this little number get to sound like a verdict on whether I'm allowed to say I feel bad?
Exactly. That's the question underneath it. The issue is the authority shift. A rough estimate starts to outrank the body it's supposed to describe. And once that happens, we have to define what the score actually is before we let it overrule anything. Before we argue about whether the score messes with people, we should pin down what the thing actually is. A sleep app is usually not giving you one pure measurement. It is turning several different signals into a summary.
Good, because people talk about these apps like they either tell the truth from Mount Sinai or they're complete nonsense. What's the first layer, the part that's closest to raw data?
Usually it's sensor data plus software making inferences from movement and other physiological signals. So the device is not watching sleep directly. It's trying to infer what state you were in from the traces your body leaves behind overnight.
So the wristband is not seeing sleep, it's reading clues and making a guess. That already sounds a lot less majestic than the marketing copy.
That's the useful distinction. The app can be tracking a real pattern, but it's still interpreting that pattern through an algorithm. That matters because once you start talking about sleep stages, you're another step removed from the body itself.
And that's where the word choices get slippery, because REM sounds serious enough to make people stop asking questions. But it's still an estimate, not a tiny brain camera clipped to your pillow.
Right. Consumer devices estimate sleep and wake using movement and physiological signals, while clinical sleep studies use direct measures like brain activity, breathing, and eye movement. Those are not the same level of evidence, so the wearable can be directionally useful without pretending to be definitive.
Okay, but I'm sticking on the score itself. People do not obsess over the raw graph. They stare at the final number like it has authority, and that's the part that feels weird.
Because the score is the easiest thing to remember. Fitbit says its sleep score is based on 3 buckets: sleep duration, sleep quality, and restoration. Oura uses multiple contributors too, like sleep latency, efficiency, restfulness, timing, and sleep stages. Different products weigh things differently, but the structure is the same. The score is a composite.
So the app is taking a bunch of imperfect estimates and compressing them into one neat-looking number. That's useful in the same way a summary is useful, but it can also make people forget how much got left out.
That's exactly the risk. A score can be handy because it turns a messy night into something readable, and trend lines over time can still mean something. If your score is usually low when you stayed up too late, or usually higher after a more regular week, that's a pattern worth noticing. But it's still not a direct readout of how rested your body feels that morning.
So the fair version is useful dashboard, not final judge. If that's the clean version, then the product pitch is doing a little more confidence than the underlying data can really support.
I think that's right, with one caveat. The number is not made up out of nowhere, and it is not useless just because it is imperfect. The problem starts when people treat it like the official story on how they slept, instead of one rough input alongside how they actually feel.
So where would you draw the line? When does a helpful metric turn into a bad authority?
When the number stops being a check and starts being a verdict. If it nudges you to notice a pattern, fine. If it makes you distrust your own sense of exhaustion every time it disagrees, now the score has too much power. And that is the social question here. Not just whether the sensors are clever enough.
Right, because the weird part is not that it is a guess, it's that a constructed guess can still boss people around like it knows more than their body does. So now we're at the next problem. What happens when the number starts arguing with your own sense of how you feel? Okay, so the 2 bad first answers are already sitting there on the table. Either you throw the app in the trash and pretend every number is fake, or you treat the score like it came down from on high and your own body is just there to apologize afterward. Both of those are comforting in a dumb way. They let you stop thinking.
That's the clean split, and it's too clean. The app can be useful without being authoritative, which sounds obvious until you watch people act like they have to choose between total rebellion and total obedience.
And that's really the thing people keep skipping. Nuance is annoying because it doesn't give you a heroic stance. It doesn't let you say, I reject the machine, or I believe the machine, like this is some little civic test of loyalty, instead of a rough health gadget that guesses at patterns.
Right. And the second bad answer is the one that sounds more grown up, but isn't. The app knows best. It doesn't know best. It knows patterns, sometimes helpful ones, sometimes noisy ones, and sometimes it's just a bossy friend with a spreadsheet and a very confident face.
That's exactly the energy. A friend like that can be useful because every so often it notices something you missed. But it is still a friend, not a judge. The annoying part is people want the authority without admitting it's mostly an estimate.
And the danger starts when the score starts talking over your own experience. If you wake up feeling wrecked and the app says you slept great, now you've got a little argument in your head about whose version counts. That can be useful if it makes you curious. It can be awful if it makes you distrust yourself for no good reason.
So here's the question I want to pin down, because this is where people get slippery. What would make the score a useful clue instead of a fake authority? Is it just the way people use it, or is the design nudging them toward taking it too seriously?
Mostly the use, but the design matters too. If the app is framed like it has discovered the truth about your sleep, people will hand over more judgment than the thing deserves. A better version would say, very plainly, here's a guess, here's the margin of error, and here's what it can and can't tell you.
That sounds almost insultingly reasonable, which is probably why it isn't the default. But I don't want to flatten it into users are gullible either, because plenty of people aren't looking for a master. They're looking for a clue. They just don't always notice when the clue starts acting like a boss.
Yeah, and that distinction matters. A clue is supposed to help you notice a pattern you might otherwise miss. A boss tells you what the pattern means and then quietly starts grading your reaction to it. Those are very different jobs, even if they wear the same little number on the screen.
And people will accept that shift because numbers feel cleaner than a messy morning. If the app says 82, that has a fake sense of certainty that is weirdly soothing. But it can also become a trap because now the number is louder than the feeling you actually had when you woke up.
That's the part worth keeping in view. The problem isn't that the score exists. The problem is when people start using it as a verdict instead of a signal. So the more honest middle ground is not ignore it and not believe it, but let it inform you without letting it overrule you. Okay, before we get too smug or too cynical, we should look at what the score is actually seeing. Because if the number is going to have opinions about your life, the least it can do is earn a little trust first.
Please. These apps always talk like they've got a clipboard and a stethoscope. I want to know whether they're measuring something real or just wrapping a guess in a nicer font.
The short version is, it is real data, but it is not clean data. A 2024 validation study found that consumer sleep devices still had important inaccuracies compared with polysomnography, and the errors weren't just tiny cosmetic misses. They varied across sleep stages and across individuals, which is a very polite way of saying the devices can be wrong in different ways depending on who's wearing them and what kind of night they had.
So the number can sound precise while the thing underneath is a little wobbly. That's basically the whole scammy-looking vibe right there. The dashboard is crisp, but the measurement is still doing a lot of guesswork.
Pretty much. And another comparison study found consumer devices had mixed, often poor results for sleep stage detection, especially for wake and N3 sleep. That matters because those are not tiny edge cases. If the device is shaky about whether you were awake or in deep sleep, then the confident little chart is already standing on a pretty thin floor.
Which is exactly the kind of thing people don't hear when the app says, "You slept 78. Excellent job, citizen." The presentation is so sure of itself that you'd think it had watched you from the ceiling all night.
And that confidence is why the useful version has to be smaller than the marketing version. As a trend tool, the score can tell you something. If your numbers keep dropping during a stressful week, or they improve after a schedule change, that's a real signal worth noticing. But a trend tool is very different from a final answer about how rested you should feel on a specific morning.
Joe, am I overstating the gap between useful trend and usable verdict? Because it feels like people hear the same graph and immediately treat it like a ruling.
No, that's the gap. The problem is not that the score is useless, it's that it comes dressed like certainty. A trend can tell you something about the past week changed. It cannot tell you your body is lying if you feel wrecked today.
That distinction matters a lot more than the apps admit. Because once the number gets a polished label, people start treating it like a verdict instead of a rough instrument. And the rougher the night, the more tempting it is to let the chart do the talking for you.
Right, and you can see how the score gets operationalized in pretty narrow ways. Aura, for example, says the score can drop if it takes more than 20 minutes to fall asleep, or if there are one long wake-up or several shorter wake-ups during the night. Fitbit says its sleep score can be affected by things like caffeine, alcohol, stress, illness, or other actions that change sleeping heart rate.
That's helpful, but it also shows the score is reading proxies, not the full experience. It's looking at clues and then acting like the clues have already testified in court.
That's the better way to put it. The score is built from indirect signs, and the indirect signs can still be useful. They just don't settle the question of whether you feel rested, which is partly physical, partly situational, and partly just how your morning feels before your brain has finished booting up.
And that's where the whole thing gets annoying in a very modern way. The app doesn't need to be totally fake to cause trouble. It just needs to be confident enough that people start asking whether they are allowed to trust the body in front of them.
Exactly. Reviews of consumer sleep wearables make the broader point pretty clearly. These tools can be useful, but they're not interchangeable with a lab sleep study, especially when nights are disrupted or sleep is poor. So if the score nudges you to notice a pattern, fine. If it tells you to ignore your actual experience because the chart is acting superior, that's where it stops being a tool and starts being a little authoritarian for no reason.
Yeah, that is the problem. The number can help you spot a trend, but it can also train you to distrust your first read on the morning. And once that happens, the question isn't just whether the app is accurate enough. It's whether you're letting an estimate outrank what your own body is telling you. Okay, so the polite answer is still floating around here. The score is just a helpful tool. It's feedback. It's a nudge. It's supposed to make sleep less vague. That's the friendly sales pitch. And honestly, I get why people like it.
That's the clean version, sure. If someone feels calmer having a number to look at, that part is real. The problem starts when the number stops being a tool and starts being the thing that tells you what your night meant.
Right, because the public version is always, this helps you understand your sleep. The lived version can be, this tells me whether I'm allowed to trust how tired I feel. Those are not the same statement at all.
That's the pressure point. The tool may begin as support, but it can become emotionally authoritative, which is a very different job. A mirror reflects you. It doesn't get to overrule you.
And that's where I think the polite language hides the real mechanism. The app says it's giving you context, but the user can end up treating the score like a verdict on whether their body is being honest with them.
Yes, and the reason that matters is self-trust is not some fluffy wellness slogan. If you keep checking the number before you check your own experience, you train yourself to doubt the experience. That's how a helper quietly becomes a referee.
So where would you draw the line? Because I don't want to pretend every person who looks at a sleep score is getting psychologically mugged by a smartwatch. Some people probably just use it like a rough note and move on.
That's the fair version. The score can be useful, but it also creates a new reference point, and reference points have power. Once people start using it to decide whether their feelings count, then it's not just information anymore. It's an authority structure, even if nobody meant it that way.
That's the bit people skip. They hear data and think that means neutral, when a lot of the time data is just anxiety wearing a cleaner shirt. It sounds objective, so the doubt feels rude.
That's the useful distinction. The number itself is not evil, and the person using it is not automatically gullible. The issue is when the app stops being a mirror and starts acting like a judge. Because then, the score is no longer helping you notice your body. It's telling your body how to be interpreted.
And once that happens, the user starts doing this weird little mental handoff. They wake up tired, but instead of beginning with, "I feel tired," they begin with, "What did the number say about me?" That's a pretty big shift for something that's supposed to be supportive.
Exactly. That doesn't prove bad intent, but it does mean we should be honest about the mechanism. Once a metric feels final, people stop asking their own body first. And if a product can make that feel normal, we should be asking who benefits from that normal.
Which is a very polite way of saying the score can become the boss. Not every time, not for every person, but enough that the question stops being, "Is this helpful?" and becomes, "Who gets to define rest now?"
Yeah, and once you ask it that way, the next question is no longer whether the number exists. It's what kind of power it has, and why the tool wants that much of it.
Okay, but once we admit the score is only part of the story, the next question is pretty obvious. Why do these apps keep putting a score in front of people every day? Because that's the part that feels less like help and more like a habit they want you to keep having.
Because a daily number is sticky. These scores are framed as daily feedback. So the app gives you something fresh to check, compare, and improve every morning. That's not proof of bad intent. It's just a very effective way to keep the product in your routine.
So where's the line for you? When does a useful feedback feature become a retention feature that's doing more work for the company than for the user?
The line is probably whether the score helps you do something or just keeps asking you to come back. If it gives you a clear, useful signal, fine. But if it mainly creates a daily check-in loop, then the product is getting value from the checking itself.
That's the annoying part. The app can say it's helping you understand your sleep while also training you to treat tomorrow morning like a little test result. The score starts as information and turns into a ritual.
That's the cleaner version of it. The product doesn't need a secret scheme for the incentive to be real. A score that feels objective is commercially useful because it's easy to understand, easy to refresh, and hard to ignore once you've started caring about it.
And once you care, the app gets to act like it's serving you while also making you do the emotional labor. You're the one deciding whether the number counts, and you're also the one carrying the disappointment when it doesn't.
Exactly. That's one of the smarter ways to look at it. A quantified label can make the evidence feel settled, even when the underlying algorithm is proprietary or device-specific, and the user can't really see how the score was assembled. The app sounds definitive, and the user gets the burden of interpretation.
So the app gets authority, and you get homework. That's a very modern deal. The number becomes the product in the sense that the number is what keeps you opening the thing, even if the company would describe it more politely.
That's fair, with one small correction. The number isn't literally the whole product, but it can carry the product. If the score is the part that makes you come back every day, that's valuable retention. And retention is worth a lot, even when the score is only partly meaningful.
And you don't need to assume anyone is twirling a mustache about it. Ordinary product incentives are enough. They build something that feels useful, make it easy to check, and then quietly benefit from the fact that people don't like leaving a number unresolved.
Right, and that's why this isn't just about one app being weird. A lot of consumer health products live inside a broader wellness and performance ecosystem, so a score can be useful as a retention feature, even if its precision is limited. Nobody needs a villain monologue. The business case can be pretty boring.
Which is almost more depressing, honestly. It means the system can be powered by normal business logic and a very ordinary human weakness for clean numbers. Once a metric is easy to glance at, it starts acting like a verdict, whether or not it deserves that much trust.
And that's the bigger point here. The internet keeps rewarding quantified self-surveillance because numbers feel cleaner than feelings. And cleaner-looking data tends to get more attention. The app didn't invent that reflex, but it knows how to use it, which is why this gets worse once people start sharing and comparing it.
Okay, so the app itself is one thing. But once this stuff gets online, it stops being a private little nudge and turns into a whole culture of checking, comparing, and performing rest. That's where it gets weird. Because now sleep isn't just something you do, it's something you can apparently do badly in public.
That's the move. The number is already doing too much, and the internet gives it an audience, which is a very efficient way to make people care more. On its own, a score can be annoying. Online, it becomes a little status object.
And then quantified self-culture kicks in and makes it sound noble. Suddenly rest is not rest, it's optimization. You're not just trying to feel okay in the morning, you're trying to improve your sleep architecture like you're tuning up a race car, which is a pretty intense way to describe going to bed at 10:30.
That framing is exactly why it spreads. The internet loves a clean metric because it feels legible. And legible things are easy to share, screenshot, compare, and argue about. If someone says, "I slept fine," there's nothing to circulate. If they say, "I got an 84," now everybody has an opinion, a theory, and a bedtime routine they want to post about.
Or a whole moral biography. Like the score proves, you're disciplined, calm, hydrated, spiritually aligned, and probably not texting after 9 p.m.
Yeah, and that's the goofy part. The number starts as a measurement, then it becomes a personality test, and then it becomes a shortcut for judging whether your self-care is respectable. None of that is in the sleep itself. It's in the social meaning people pile onto it once they see other people talking about it.
And the online version rewards certainty. Nobody gets traction by saying, "This is one tool among many. It might be useful, it might annoy you, and you should still trust your body sometimes." That's too honest for a feed. What goes viral is the person who sounds like they've discovered the secret sleep code.
That's the pressure point. Influencer-style advice makes ordinary sleep habits sound like hidden knowledge. Suddenly, basic stuff is packaged like a system only insiders understand. Wear the thing, check the number, follow the ritual, unlock the better version of yourself. It's not that those habits are fake, it's that the certainty around them gets inflated, because certainty travels well online.
And if you're already anxious, that certainty is catnip, because now you don't have to sit with, "I feel tired and I don't know why." You get a cleaner story. The app has the answer. The thread has the answer. The influencer has the answer. That is comforting for about 5 minutes. And then you're back in the app asking it whether your feelings were valid.
Which is why overchecking becomes normal online. People see other people refreshing, posting, comparing, and explaining their score like it matters more than how they actually feel. So it starts to seem like that's just the responsible way to do it. The internet doesn't create the obsession out of nowhere, but it normalizes the behavior faster than a private habit ever would.
So the app is the hook, but the feed is the amplifier. And once people start treating sleep like a public optimization game, the weirdest part is that everybody thinks they're being careful. They're not saying, I'm chasing a number for no reason. They're saying, I'm being responsible, which is a very convenient way to make anxiety sound like discipline.
That's the uncomfortable version, yeah. The internet doesn't invent the anxiety from scratch, but it gives it a scoreboard and a comment section, and both are excellent at making a private feeling feel up for debate. And once that happens, the next question is whether people are just trapped by the system, or whether they keep feeding it because they want the certainty it promises.
Okay, but here's the part we keep skipping. We don't just get sold the score. We ask for it. We want the app to tell us whether we slept well enough so we don't have to sit there with the annoying, messy answer ourselves.
That's the uncomfortable self-own. And it's not a small one. A number is cleaner than, I feel weird and I don't know why. And people will absolutely pay for clean when the alternative is sitting in ambiguity for 10 minutes.
So what are people really buying there? The data or the permission? Because those are not the same thing, even if the app tries very hard to make them look identical.
Mostly permission, with a little data mixed in so it feels earned. The app gets to sound like it's reporting reality when a lot of the time it's really handing you a verdict. And verdicts are sticky because they feel finished.
Yeah, and that's why it works. If your morning feeling is vague, the score gives you something to blame, trust, or argue with, which is weirdly comforting even when it's not especially accurate.
And sometimes it's not even blame. Sometimes it's a ritual. Check the app, get the number, move on. I don't want to flatten that into people are outsourcing their souls, because a lot of people just want trend feedback, a rough pattern, something to notice over time.
That's fair. Joe, do you think the apps are pushing the certainty, or are they just giving people the certainty they already came looking for?
Both, probably. The user demand creates the market, and then the market teaches the user what to expect back. If people reward a confident score more than a careful estimate, the product naturally starts talking like it knows more than it does.
That's the annoying loop. We want the number, then we pretend the number is a neutral witness instead of a product built to keep us coming back. And once a thing is good at calming you down for 60 seconds, it's amazing how much authority we hand it.
Right, but that's also where the self-critique has to stay fair. Wanting reassurance is normal. The problem starts when reassurance becomes the whole relationship, and the tool stops being information and starts being a replacement for your own judgment.
So the distinction is using it as a check versus letting it become the final word. If it helps you notice a pattern, that's one thing. If a number starts deciding whether you trust your own body, that's where it gets bossy.
That's the clean version. A healthier tool would stay humble enough to say, this is a rough signal, not, here is the truth of your morning. And a healthier habit would leave room for the body feeling one way while the score says something else, because those two things can both be worth looking at.
Yeah, and maybe that's the real target. Not killing the number, just refusing to let it outrank the person using it. You can want the feedback without turning it into a little judge in your pocket.
Exactly. Keep the feedback, lose the pretend certainty. And the next question is what a tool like that should say if it wants to help without pretending it can crown your feelings as valid or invalid.
Okay, but if we're actually trying to fix the thing, what's the realistic move? Because the problem isn't just that the score exists. It's that a lot of people wake up, see the number, and let it decide whether their tiredness is real or just them being dramatic about being tired.
That's the first fix, honestly. Change what the score means. It should be rough feedback about patterns, not a morning ruling on your body. If it's useful, it should point you toward habits over time, not tell you how you are supposed to feel at 7 a.m.
And the apps don't exactly encourage humility. They put the number front and center, like it has a personal opinion about you. And then everyone acts surprised when people start arguing with their own sleep.
Right, so the design should do the opposite. Show the score with context. What changed? What stayed stable? What the last few nights look like? So the person sees a pattern before they see a grade. That's a much better use of the same information than dropping a single number on the screen and calling it insight.
Not a little badge that says you passed.
Exactly. And if the interface is all urgency and bright little alerts, people start reacting to the app instead of using it. Fewer push notifications, less morning drama, less look at me now energy would help a lot. The tool should feel like something you check, not something that taps you on the shoulder all day.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the product should almost make the score harder to act on impulsively? Not hard to find, just harder to turn into a verdict before your coffee has even done its job.
That's basically the right instinct. Not harder to use, just harder to misuse. A decent version would slow you down for 10 seconds and ask you to look at trends, not just the first number that lands in your lap. If the design interrupts the reflex, even a little, you've already made it less bossy.
That feels like the real user habit, too. Weekly review is probably better than daily judgment, or at least weekly review plus daily shrugging. Most people are not going to become serene little data monks before coffee. And honestly, the app shouldn't need that level of enlightenment to stay useful.
No, and they shouldn't have to. The same habit is boring. Check patterns over time, notice what usually happens, and let one bad night stay one bad night. Consumer trackers are useful for broad sleep patterns, but they're not a definitive measure of nightly sleep quality. So the smart use is information first, judgment last.
So the rule is basically, this can inform me, but it doesn't get to overrule me. The number can tell you something happened, but it doesn't get to be the boss of the morning just because it showed up in a neat little box.
That's the useful middle ground. Fitbit's own guidance points people toward improving sleep habits, heart health, and activity levels, which is a decent reminder that the score is supposed to support behavior change, not sit there acting like a final answer. The label matters here. It's feedback, not a sentence.
And Aura's version is the same kind of logic, right? Latency, restfulness, timing, efficiency, all the little contributors that make the score a summary instead of a truth machine. That's a lot less annoying than a single number pretending it somehow knows the whole story.
Yeah, that's the part worth keeping. Put the contributors and the trend line in front of the user. Let the score sit a layer back. And don't train people to treat every morning like a referendum on whether they slept correctly. If the pattern is what matters, the presentation should say that out loud.
Would you actually hide the score by default, though, or is that too paternalistic? Because there's a difference between helping people and making the app act like it knows better than they do.
Maybe not hide it entirely. I'd lower its authority. Less aggressive placement, less notification pressure, more friction before a person turns it into a personal diagnosis. Put the trends where your eye lands first. Keep the number available, and make the user do a little work before they decide what the morning means. The goal isn't to pretend the number doesn't exist. It's to keep it from talking louder than the body.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Keep the tool, lower its authority, and make weekly review the norm, so the app doesn't become a daily critic before breakfast.
Exactly. The score can stay, but it cannot outrank the body.
So I think the clean landing is this. The score can be useful, but only as a hint. The second it starts acting like a verdict on whether you slept well, it goes off the rails. People aren't chasing numbers because they worship numbers. They're chasing a little reassurance, a way to know whether to trust the awful groggy feeling or whether they just woke up in a bad mood and want the app to stop them from spiraling.
That's the cleanest version. The appeal is obvious because sleep is hard to read from the inside. You can wake up foggy and not know whether you're depleted, stressed, whatever, or just having one of those days where the brain boots up slowly. A score gives you a handle on that. The problem is when the handle turns into a ruler and the app starts measuring whether your own experience is allowed to count.
Right, and that's the real line for me. It's not, can a tool track something? Of course it can. It's whether the tool gets promoted from tracker to referee. Wellness tech shows up saying, we're just helping, and then somehow it ends up with a voice in the argument. One rough morning and people are already waiting for the graph to tell them what they actually felt. Ugh, that's where the whole thing gets annoying. The body says one thing, the app says another, and the app is suddenly speaking like it's the adult in the room.
And to be fair, sometimes people do need that external structure because their own sense of sleep is too vague to be useful. If a score helps somebody notice a pattern or realize their schedule is all over the place, that's real value. I just wouldn't let it make the final call. A good tool should reduce confusion, not become the replacement for judgment.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the danger isn't the number itself, it's the moment people start using the number to argue with their own experience, because that feels like the line. If you wake up wrecked and the app says you were optimal, the app is not wiser than your body. It's a device making a confident guess from partial information.
No, that's exactly the line. The useful version of the score is, here's a rough read, here's a prompt, here's something to compare against your own pattern over time. The bad version is, your feelings are invalid until the app approves them. That's not precision. That's overreach with a friendly interface. And the friendliness is part of the problem because it makes the claim feel smaller than it is.
People reach for these apps because they want certainty, and certainty is seductive when you're tired. If you've had enough mornings where you can't tell whether you slept badly or just feel off, a score looks like relief, but relief is not authority. An app can help you describe the day. It should not get to define the day.
And if the score and your body keep disagreeing, that doesn't mean one is pure and the other is garbage. It means the measurement is incomplete, or the measurement doesn't capture that kind of night very well, or the person is having a rough day for reasons the app can't see. That's normal. What isn't normal is handing the whole argument over to the app just because it sounds tidy. Tidy is not the same thing as true.
So the boring answer is probably the right one. Use the score if it helps you notice patterns. Ignore it if it starts making you doubt your own read on your own body. And don't let your phone become your sleep therapist. Helpful second opinion? Yes. Boss of your feelings? No.
That's where I land too. Better tools should make you less confused, not more obedient. Trust the body first, the number second. And if the number keeps trying to win a fight your body already settled, the number can sit down. That's the whole job. Useful data. No final authority attached. And with that, we're done with this question. Thanks for spending a few minutes with Say the Question. Subscribe or follow, and we'll be back tomorrow.